You have this big organization in Cognizant, a lot of resources, a lot of support that you can bring to the table, and yet you're still serving an industry that's still lagging in some ways behind other industries. So there's got to be some inherent challenges to, to what's available. What are you coming across?
I think the very first thing that we face in this industry is just risk, tolerance for risk and worries about risk and the concept of zero defect. The moment a drug is released and by chance it actually has a incredibly bad side effect. And we all remember the thalidomide tragedy of years back, right, where a drug was developed that essentially precipitated a complete redesign of the drug development system. Flipper babies is what the condition was that was called when pregnant women took a drug that was meant to calm down their central nervous system and give them a reasonably good night of sleep, but its side effects were tragic. That's an extreme, and of course that is to be avoided. But even in recent times, we've seen a whole range of these discussions, including around vaccines. Are these safe? In the case of COVID-19 vaccines, this risk tolerance issue becomes an impediment to innovation. And in fact, I think we could stay on the vaccine story for a while, right? To say we are seeing such a hesitancy among a large percentage of the population that is really connected to not saying, does it work? But I will question if the efficacy is worth my perception of risk. And if that equation goes the other way, then this will not be allowed. So regulators have to be extra careful. Now let's tie this to something that we know we at Cognizant have worked on a great deal, not just in the collection of data and the pharmacovigilance systems, because we do everything from case processing through to the technologies such as RSG and so on that are part of a approved set of technology platforms for codifying the data and analysis. Decentralized clinical trials. We had talked for well over a decade about why the world of clinical trials had to move from all patients coming to one centralized clinical center where everything could be controlled so that there'd be no variability in the protocol and the data. And as a result of that, we get clean and pure data which would go into a good submission. We talked about why that approach may actually create problems. And the best example, by the way, I can think of is, would you ever do a sleep apnea study where you'd give someone a drug in a hospital setting? Just the very act of taking a patient away from their own bed and making them sleep, for 7 nights in a hospital bed, that's like a massive Hawthorne effect, right? The experimental condition changes the patient state. Decentralized clinical studies allowed us to have as a concept the ability to say, you stay where you are, we'll bring the medical practice to you. We'll administer the drug, we'll do all the monitoring. We knew that this was coming. It wouldn't have come about. Our clients wouldn't have been able to move if it hadn't been for the COVID-19 wave that began in March of 2020, right? Suddenly the world changed and our clients began to say to us, we know that you've got a lot of components of what will be a quiver of arrows in the DCT value chain. Can you make this available to us? So while we've been talking about it and doing this, point by point from March of last year, this just became a big industry. And now, of course, DCT is very mainstay. Lots of regulations have been released. I'll talk about a third point, and then I'll give you a chance to ask me more questions. Regulators themselves are in response to real and sometimes perceived fear of backlash from consumers and legislators, can sometimes create hurdles that come in the way of innovation and serving what in the end ultimately is the patient. And an example of that is the European GDPRs, these digital privacy rights. They allow for making sure that the patient is able to control their own data, right? Which is all very good. But a lot of clinical studies require that the physician investigators, the PIs, working with pharmaceuticals and with their academic medical centers and review boards to make sure that everything is protected and done in a kosher fashion, that they have access to these data sets and they don't constantly require the patient giving consent. And yet GDPRs have put a block that makes it hard for existing trial design and processes to work. And so regulators can also sometimes, unfortunately, stifle innovation. Now, in many ways, from a services point of view, I'd say, well, that just means more business for us, right? But that's not the approach I want. The approach is, can we really solve for a genuine problem?
Wow. We talk a bit about the scale and impact of these decentralized trials. I saw, about 1,300 clinical trials with a virtual or decentralized component will start in the next year, representing this pretty big increase since 2021, a dramatic 93% boost from 2020, according to global data analysis. So, I mean, really interesting to see the data around these DCT elements. And I'm curious about what does this mean now for the patient experience, the payer, the provider, now that these kind of decentralized clinical trials are, like you said, more open and more public now.
Some things are known, and some things are models, business models in progress. Right? So I think anyone who very strongly claims the world has shifted from centralized academic medical center trials to DCTs, just laugh at them and tell them. I think what we do know is that there are some elements of decentralization that have incredible value to multiple constituents in the system. So let's start with the very first part of it, which is finding patients and having sticky patients, patients who want to be part of a clinical trial. Search engine optimization and querying through that set gives you a population set of patients who are, for the most part, significantly motivated. If I went online and typed, stage 2 pancreatic carcinoma, potential drugs in development, and you didn't have to know my name, you just knew that someone in California was searching, you'd be thinking, there's a potential patient for the clinical trial I'm running. And if I can figure out a way to reach him through legal channels without initially breaking his confidentiality so he can volunteer for this, I'm going to have a patient. He's going to want to enroll in this, right? So that is the first part. The data set can be enriched through virtualization and decentralization versus the old-fashioned way of having a patient show up in the doctor's office in a harried state with a caregiver. Doctor is giving him terrible news. This is a very life-threatening disease, and we might, with existing drugs, I think we can give you 3 to 6 months of survival. And by the way, some of these drugs are incredibly toxic, and the patient and the family is crying and thinking about, what's life suddenly turned to. And at the end of that, someone says, would you like to enroll in a clinical trial? And you're going, no, I'll take these 40 pages and go home and I'll forget about it. Right? So this is a very different way of finding the patients, enrolling them, identifying and enrolling. Then comes all of the paperwork around it. If that can be done in e-fashion, which it absolutely can be done in a DCT way, it also gives patients a chance to actually think this through, solve for things like, what does this term mean? Let me ask my friend, let me ask another physician, let me go online and say. So all of this process results in a more informed patient, better yields, and then most importantly, a return to typically an academic medical center, but a large medical center for any kind of treatment means that you have to absorb in that study the cost of the entirety of that medical center. The $1 million NMR that is not required for this study is part of the capital infrastructure that gets allocated, right? So every study just gets hugely more expensive when all these costs are laden onto that one study. Whereas in the case of the patient who's getting dosed at home, yes, there are ancillary extra costs. We're going to send a nurse or a nurse practitioner with a drug to your home who will administer this drug. So there's that cost, but it is not the cost of Stanford Hospital divided by 1,000 patients. It's just a dramatically different number. So it becomes more affordable. So and affordability in this case means we can launch many more studies, right? The portfolio gets larger. So the truth can be generated faster. Monitoring at home or near home or with your preferred physician, also an easier model. By the way, I guess I could go on, but through all of this, what we have shown is there are parts that work, whether it is remote monitoring, whether it is enrollment, whether it is e-pro, patient-reported outcomes, a whole range of things that are all very useful. I think what we should posit today is this. When the dust settles, we will end up with virtualization and decentralization as a significant enough model with a whole range of functionality that will be part of a hybrid model in which some patients get treated in hospitals, some at home. The biostatistical models can account for that variability. So these are not two different kinds of patients. And that allows us to get to the ultimate submission to the regulatory agency saying, we have, with good conscience, run the clinical study and shown that this drug works, which is the claim we want to make, or it didn't work because that's what the analysis showed us.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Please subscribe to this channel for more great marketing interviews with today's top industry leaders. And thank you to our partners at Salesforce. Salesforce brings marketing and engagement together. Head over to salesforce.com/marketing.